Hi, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Mike Lecouteur. Vashti Kapelos is on assignment today. Tonight, Israeli embassy staff killed in Washington, D.C.
The rise in anti-Semitism is unacceptable, and it must stop.
They were gunned down outside a Jewish museum in the U.S. Capitol. In moments, we'll talk with Israel's ambassador to Canada, Ido Moed. Then, what's next for the NDP? Interim leader Don Davies is trying to make a case for official party status in the House of Commons. He's here to talk about his pitch to keep their standing in Parliament. Plus, a postal strike just hours away. We've got the latest details as the second work stoppage in 6 months could be coming for Canada Post. But first,
I am absolutely appalled and horrified by the murder of 2 Israeli diplomats in Washington, D.C. My thoughts are with their friends, their families, and the broader Jewish community, not only in the United States, but here in Canada. The rise in anti-Semitism is unacceptable, and it must stop.
2 staff members from the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C., Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram, were killed last night as they left a Jewish museum event in Washington, D.C. Chicago native 30-year-old Elias Rodriguez has been identified as the suspect, and we are hearing that he has been charged with first-degree murder. Rodriguez was heard shouting "Free Palestine" as he was arrested. Washington police chief says he is the lone suspect, and he did approach a group of 4 people and then open fire. The tragedy has drawn condemnation and condolences from across the globe, including from Prime Minister Mark Carney. In a statement, he said that he's devastated and appalled by the murders. He also called it a, quote, targeted attack against the Jewish community, a violent act of anti-Semitism. Carney added, "This hate is intolerable, and I condemned it in the strongest terms." Earlier today, I sat down with Israel's ambassador to Canada, Ido Moed. We spoke about the shooting and how he was summoned by Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand today. The minister is asking for a full investigation after shots were fired near Canadian diplomats in the West Bank. Here's my conversation with Ambassador Moed. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome back to Power Play.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with the tragic shooting in Washington, D.C. Officials there are saying the early indication is there's an act of targeted violence. How concerned are you about this type of violence, not only south of the border, but here on this side as well?
I'm, first of all, heartbroken and very saddened to know last night that our colleagues just across the border were targeted by this insane terrorist. And the 2 very dear young people were killed. A couple that was supposed to get engaged next week in Jerusalem. We are enraged by that, but we are also strengthened by the fact that we are very strong and resilient. And when we are talking about that, we are talking resilient to what? And that is the anti-Semitism. The incredible rise in anti-Semitism that is happening also on this side of the border. And so when you combine that with very aggressive hate marches around streets and buildings here in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Montreal, and other parts of Canada, we see what the result can be. It can be lethal. Anti-Semitism can be lethal. So my reaction is we have to act against anti-Semitism today. We have to act now. We have to do whatever we can so that law enforcement and education institutions and everybody else that is involved in that is more able, more capable, more knowledgeable about the task at hand. And it is about saving lives. It is not just about getting a history lesson about the Holocaust. It's about understanding how we tolerate each other, how we live in peace with each other.
Prime Minister Carney put out a statement today condemning the attacks, first of all, but also talking about how his government is ready to fight that rising tide of hate, as you had talked about, and protect Canadian communities. He said, quote, "We'll increase funding to the Canada Community Security Program and introduce legislation to make it a criminal offence to intentionally and willfully obstruct access to any place of worship, school, community centre, and a criminal offence to willfully intimidate or threaten those attending services at these locations." Do you think that's good enough?
I think it's a step in the right direction, but I can tell you from Israel's perspective, worldwide, we are the Jewish state, the state of the Jewish people, and so we are very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism around the world, and we always do whatever we can to raise awareness to that. And actually, this week, Foreign Minister Gideon Saar is hosting an international conference on the International Holocaust Remembrance Coalition, an organization that came out with guidelines which Canada already implemented, but as a framework, it exists on the ground as we see on the streets here. I'm not sure that anything is done about that. And again, it's not for me to say, but I will speak to the fact that 400,000 Jews living in Canada are a very important part and parcel of the bilateral relations between the two countries. They are very involved with Israel. And so when they feel intimidated, when they feel sometimes even left alone, we are concerned about how and what is exactly done to combat anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism here in Canada. According to our numbers, 670% rise since October the 7th. That's enormous. That's actually almost the highest around the world, if not the highest. So the challenge is to act now, to act forcefully, and to do whatever is possible in all fields, including law enforcement, including implementation, including education programs, so that society is better prepared to mitigate this phenomenon.
You were talking about the bilateral relations, and I wanted to ask you that you were summoned by Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand today to answer for what happened in the West Bank yesterday, where 4 members of a Canadian delegation were shot at. She asked for a full investigation. Is that going to happen?
So there are several details here that I must correct with your permission. It was happened yesterday, but nobody was shot at. Nobody. There were some shots fired in the air and warning shots. And I don't think that the delegation or anybody around that side felt that he was shot at. Other part is that Israel already published yesterday a wide range of details regarding what we understand has happened. And so there is no need to call for an investigation. All of that has already, it's past us, it's happened already. We've done it out of our own course, as we do with every international event or any event that is happening inside Israel. But this time it was also published in English so that everybody will be able to understand. So let's just unpack this. This event happened because a group was going in Jenin, which is an active combat zone. So they knew we're entering an active combat zone where shots may be fired. They were led by Palestinians. The route was coordinated with the Israeli authorities, but they deviated from that route. And if you'll see the diagram, the map that we published, they actually went a block and a half further. So it's not just taking a wrong turn. They really went much further and into a position of IDF soldiers who saw a group coming towards them and then fired warning shots in the air. What the IDF did is, first of all, to understand what happened. Second, to address the soldiers to make sure that in this kind of cases, perhaps it wasn't the wisest thing to do to fire shots in the air in any direction anyway, but also to approach those diplomats to explain to them what is happening on the ground. So all of that already happened before this formal step was taken.
So how did Minister Anand then respond to this explanation that I'm assuming you gave to her?
I didn't speak directly with Minister Anand, but with her staff, but I made sure that all those details are there, and I haven't heard since then very much. But
so you feel like there's no other explanation needed and no other investigation needed?
No, I didn't say that. Actually, we have also published that the investigation is still ongoing, but we already released details. So we're not waiting to complete the investigation. We want people to understand exactly what has happened. If Israeli soldiers were at fault, and perhaps that may have been the case in the firing the shots in the air, on that we already said the IDF regrets that. We publish all those details as a normal procedure.
I understand your point on that, but also Prime Minister Carney yesterday said that yesterday's incident is one of many things that are totally unacceptable happening in the region. And this comes on the heels of that joint statement with Canada, France, and the United Kingdom, saying that they are concerned at the level of human suffering in Gaza, calling it intolerable. And they've asked your government to stop its military operations in Gaza and to allow humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. I know that some has since flowed in there, but what is your government doing to respond to that? Specifically, there is a threat there at further action, further sanctions to the Israeli government from those three countries. What is your response to that?
For us, it's unacceptable that 58 hostages are being held in Gaza for 600 days.
And they did say that in their statement as well. They did say that that is unacceptable, and that the October 7th attack was also unacceptable.
Unacceptable for us, and therefore we take action to extract them. Hamas will not lay down their weapons. Hamas will not release them. Had they done that almost 2 years ago, 19 months ago, there would have been any kind of war. But we are in a war, and Hamas is not a country, and Hamas doesn't care about the law, it doesn't care about the lives of Palestinians or Israelis. They just want to rule and instill their rule of hate and extremism. And they are the ones that we should be all fighting against, and not between. There is no fight between Canada and Israel, and I don't think there will be. But I do understand from a threat to Israel, when it pursues a war of defense, that is something that we cannot do anything with that.
I understand that, and I take your point, and I think the Canadian government does as well. But they have also said in that joint statement, quote, this escalation is wholly disproportional, but at the same time is calling the October 7th attacks as heinous. So is there not a ground in there to meet somewhere and to understand where these three countries are coming from and to respond to it as well in terms of making sure that there is aid getting into Gaza to ensure that the people there are getting what is necessary? Because even the UN has talked about that 11-week blockade that they said was very difficult, and the amount of aid that is even getting in right now, they said, is essentially trickling in.
There is unfortunately, there's a huge gap between what you and I agree is a normal, healthy world, accountable world, a world that seeks peace and prosperity, and the vision that others have in the Middle East. Because of that discrepancy, the terminology, the understanding that exists here about resolving problems is not adequate for the Middle East. There is nothing there is no other way to put it. When we are trying to extract our hostages, and you know that Israel has the military power to conquer that little piece of land in a day. Mm-hmm. We are not doing that. We are trying to do whatever we can to spare lives, but to get our hostages back. We've been doing that for 600 days, and we will continue to act in that same vein until they're out. But we do have to make sure that the hostages are out, that Hamas will not threaten Israel anymore, and Hamas will not be in power of Gaza. We agree on that with Canada, on that last part, all those three issues. The way to get there is Israel's sole let's say it's in our discretion to decide, because it is our security that is threatened. It's not Canada's security that is threatened. It's not Canadian cities that are being shot at. And so this is why for us, we understand and we listen very carefully to what the international community says. And again, I'm going back to what we discussed before. We have this exchange on all levels, on all topics. And we see eye to eye on many of those issues. And even if we disagree, we understand, we know why. And so when we are going into a new domain of threats, that's where I'm asking myself, are we going to take those bilateral relations, that dialogue that we used to have, are we going to push that aside? Are we going to destroy that for the sake of I don't know what? Because at some point in time we realize that it doesn't work anymore or it doesn't help us anymore. And I'm saying that it is not what we want to do. It is not what Israel wants to do. But if we are entering that new terrain, we have to remember that a dialogue between countries is based on trust and mutual respect and mutual understanding of our interests. And when that breaks down, that has repercussions. And that's very unfortunate. But when we look at the repercussions are for the relations, for the trade, for the exchange, for the exchange between the Jewish community, for the lives of Jewish community. And this is something that is very dear to all of us. And I hear that every day, that it is very dear to many Canadians. So I implore the government also to keep that in mind.
Okay, Ambassador, I'm going to have to leave it there. We're all out of time. Ambassador Ido Moed, who is the Israeli ambassador to Canada, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Still to come, the future of the new Democratic Party. Will the NDP be able to keep party status? And what's the plan to rebuild after a devastating election result? Interim leader Don Davies will be here after this break. When MPs return to Ottawa on Monday, it will be to a very different House of Commons seating chart. The NDP is down to just 7 seats, and it's lost official party status. With it, all of those parliamentary resources that often go with party status. So what are they planning to bring to the House as a result? Well, joining us now is the interim leader of the NDP, Don Davies. Thanks for being here. Welcome back to Power Play.
Thank you, Mike.
So what is the status right now of those discussions that you have been having to try and gain party status in the House of Commons?
Well, the first thing to note is that we are in a minority parliament. You know, nobody has a majority, so that means that parties have to talk to one another in a way that they often don't in a majority. You know, we have 7 spirited members of the NDP caucus who want to bring the voices of millions of working people to Parliament. And, you know, we're going to do our job no matter what. But if we can get additional tools to do our job, we're going to advocate for that. And so that's what we're doing with other parties, is we're engaging in discussions with them to see what kind of extra resources we might be able to access in order to do our job better.
Do you think you're further ahead now than you were about a few weeks ago when you were starting this process, talking to the government and different parties to try and gain party status?
Yeah, we definitely are. We definitely are. And, you know, again, when you're in a minority and you have established relationships with other parties, there's an opportunity to work together in a way that I said in a majority just doesn't happen. So we're making good progress. Our relationships are good with both Liberals and Conservatives, and we're opening up a channel to talk with the Bloc Québécois as well. And we're very optimistic that things will move forward.
To play devil's advocate, why do you deserve it when you consider that the people voted and they decided you get 7 seats? Why do you deserve official party status when the bar is 12?
Well, official party status is one thing, but having tools and resources to carry out our parliamentary functions is another. And those are 2 separate things. So,
are you working on 2 different fronts? In other words, you're not looking for party status, but you want those resources, and would you take one without the other?
Well, there's different ways to get it. I mean, I think the bottom line is that we want the tools that we can get to help us discharge our parliamentary functions as effectively as possible. You know, that's things like access to question period, access to committees, you know, things like where you sit in the House. Do you have space in West Block? Do we have access to the online voting dashboard? These are all tools and things that recognized parties get that when you're a caucus of 7, you don't automatically get, but will help us all function better. And it's in everybody's interest, I think, to function, I think, as effectively as possible in a minority situation.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your leadership, because you were named the interim leader, but that has been questioned by 3, basically half your caucus. If you sort of take you out of the caucus, half of them. So Jenny Kwan, Leah Gazan, and Laura Idlot. The Globe and Mail obtained a letter that they sent to the party saying that there was no consultation. They subsequently said they support you. Have you reached out to these 3 to try and mend fences here with the process? And do they really have do you have their backing fully, do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, we had a tough election, Mike, there's no question about that. And it was very dislocating for all of us. And so I think what's happened is that we've had to deal with some issues that normally you don't have to deal with, but all parties do at different time. You know, we were without our leader who didn't win a seat. What I can tell you is we've had very positive meetings together. We had a caucus meeting yesterday, and I can tell you there's a very strong commitment in our caucus among all 7 caucus members to work together in a united way and bring the voices of those 1.2 million Canadians who voted for us, that we feel a very strong obligation to, all of us in our caucus. And that's to fight for things that we heard during the election. People need an affordable house. People need a good family-sustaining job. The price of groceries and utilities and everything else is too high for too many people. Businesses are worried about tariffs. So what unites us as a caucus is a very fervent desire to bring those voices to Parliament and to advocate for the policies that we know people need. And I'm confident that that's going to drive us forward in a very strong, coherent way.
Are you confident that your caucus will stick together? Weeks ago, you had said the Liberals are putting out feelers to your MPs, asking them whether or not they'd want to cross the floor. Can you guarantee that the 7 inside the NDP are going to stay as members of the NDP?
I'm 100% confident in our caucus, every member.
And that none of them will want to be tempted or even look to go elsewhere?
Look, Mike, we have 7 strong New Democrats. These are powerful, passionate, experienced parliamentarians that care deeply about their communities and the NDP. And so I'm just 100% confident in the commitment and in the skill set of our colleagues. I've said before, we don't have 1 leader in the NDP. We have 7 leaders in the NDP. And I think that we're going to be a very powerful caucus moving forward. And we're going to stick together, and we're going to, I think, surprise a lot of people.
Taking a step back here, the electorate did send a pretty strong message to the NDP that it was not the first, second, or even third choice for a number of people. What do you think are the changes that need to happen with the NDP going forward to recapture some of that vote and to really appeal to more people? I mean, some people look at this as, you know, a fork in the road for you to figure out what the NDP needs to do next.
Well, first, I'm not sure about the premise that people have left the NDP. I think a lot of people, a lot of New Democrats were very concerned about Donald Trump. I think they were worried about the chaos he was sowing in our country. And I think a lot of people parked their vote, lent their vote, might be a good expression to use, with the Liberals. There were still other New Democrats that didn't want a Liberal government again after 10 years of what they perceived to be a failure of government for them, and parked their vote with the Conservatives. So I don't think it's a rejection of all of those people who have voted New Democrat in the past, of our policies. I still think we have the best policies for working people in this country of any political party.
But they still didn't choose them. I mean,
Exactly.
and I understand the Trump factor. At the same time, if they felt strongly enough about it, they still would have believed in an NDP party potentially forming government. And do you think that that's out of reach?
No, I don't think it's out of reach, but I do think there's a strong message to the NDP, Mike, that we have to reconnect with working people in this country. I think that's a fair question. Even though we believe we have the best policies for working people, somehow there's been a disconnect between communicating that for working people to feel it. So that's why one thing I want to do as interim leader, whether that's 6, 8, 10, or 12 months, is I want to travel this country. I want to go to the shop floor. I want to go to union halls. I want to meet gig workers, service workers, healthcare workers, public sector workers, and meet them where they're at and listen to them. And I think my caucus colleagues want to do that as well. And I think once we start reconnecting with working people and understanding where that disconnect has occurred, I think that we're going to come back very strongly as the Labour Party of Canada.
I've only got about 30 seconds left, and I hope you can answer it in this amount of time. Where do you think the NDP actually needs to go, though, on the political spectrum? Closer to the center, more to the left? I mean, is this going to be more of a grassroots party? Where do you see it going, and what should the next leader look like?
I think we have to reconnect with working people, Mike. I mean, the vast majority of people in this country, you know, I'm guessing 75, 80%, are people who go to work every day and they trade their time for salaries and for wages, and we want to reconnect with them. So I don't know if that's left or center, but where we're centering our policies is with working people, and I think that's the path forward for us.
How long of a time do you think that path will take you forward? And I know you had said as interim leader, upwards of 12 months. But where do you see the NDP being able to rebuild into the next election, or do you think you're stuck here for a while?
Oh no, we could rebuild. Politics can move fast. You know, I mean, you look at where the Liberals were in December of last year. They were headed for electoral disaster. And they changed leaders, brought in Mr. Carney, and in 4 months from now, you know, our government again. That's how fast politics can change in this country. And so I'm very optimistic that when the NDP reimagines, we reconnect, we rebuild, we reimagine the progressive option for the NDP, I think we can move very quickly to regain the trust of working people, and we'll be right back in contention.
Okay, got to leave it there. Don Davies, interim leader of the NDP. Thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
Turning now to beautiful Banff, Alberta, where François-Philippe Champagne is closing his first G7 finance ministers meeting
We had very constructive and productive discussion. We understand that we need to reduce uncertainty in order to increase growth. I think, we went back to basics. For me, this G7 is back to basic, back to the core mission. Our mission, my mission when I entered the room, was really to promote stability and growth. And I would say of all the international meetings I've attended, this was one where you had frank discussion, that people shared views on different issues, but also there was a strong call to actions. We found common ground on a number of things.
So this meeting is seen as a precursor to the G7 summit next month in Kananaskis. And today, the White House officially confirmed that U.S. President Donald Trump will be attending. CTV's Rachel Aiello joins us live from Banff with the very latest. And Rachel, with all of these summits, we look for whether or not they could agree on an outcome and a final communique. So what was in it and what was left out of it?
Yeah, hey, Mike. So, yes, the fact that the joint communique was reached, Canada's finance minister is touting as a win and a sign of unity within the G7. Some of what was agreed to over the meetings that took place yesterday and today were Canada agreeing to $4.8 million as part of this broader financial crime call to action. There's also wording in here about addressing the risks of low value shipments. These, Mike, are things like the flooding in of cheap products from places like Shein or Temu. That is something I think we can kind of tie to the broader concern about China. And then there was shared messaging in here about Ukraine, once again, re-upping its support for Ukraine, the G7 support. But it's worth noting, Mike, this was one of the areas where there were some notable omissions. In past communiques, we've seen the G7 refer to Russia's invasion as illegal. That wasn't in here. And I asked the finance minister, is this about watering things down to appease Besant? He said no. Some of the other notable wording things here, Mike, trade was only mentioned once and tariffs not at all.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that did really hang over this, right, Rachel?
Yeah, absolutely. So clearly, U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war and the tariffs that he's imposed on all of the other G7 countries, including Canada, were essentially the elephant in the room. And so I asked Canada's finance minister that specifically. Was this just the elephant hanging in the air, or was this addressed head on? And Mike, that he said, clearly tariffs did come up. He said these kinds of conversations around the G7 is where frank conversations can be had, constructive conversations, but clearly no resolution. It's looking like at this point, all of these G7 nations are going to have to negotiate on their own with the U.S. to come to some sort of agreement. So as we're kind of looking to Kananaskis next month, that is where we're going to see that conversation shift. We've got the kind of base level foundation set here in Banff, and then we'll see what comes when Donald Trump gets aboard Air Force One and comes to the Rocky Mountains to meet again with Prime Minister Mark Carney.
Exactly. Okay, thanks for that. CTV's Rachel Aiello in Banff, Alberta at the G7 Finance Ministers meeting. Thanks so much for this, Rachel. We're going to talk a little more about that meeting in just a moment with our front bench. But first, as we head to break, earlier today, Prime Minister Mark Carney took on his other title. He was officially sworn in as the MP of Nepean, a riding in the Ottawa suburbs. It paves the way for him to officially take his seat in the House of Commons on Monday when Parliament resumes. Power Play will resume right after this.
During this week's meeting, we had productive and frank discussions. Very constructive, very engaging discussion on the global economy, on global imbalances, on non-market policies and practices, which have led to overcapacity, combating financial crime, and artificial intelligence. So as you can see, we had a broad-based agenda, and we found common grounds. This is what the G7 is about. You have the largest economy in the world, and we found common ground on the most pressing global issues that we face.
That was Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne at the G7 Finance Ministers meeting in Banff, Alberta. Now, it was held ahead of the G7 leaders meeting in Kananaskis, Alberta, in just over 3 weeks. We do know that U.S. President Donald Trump will be there. But what else can Prime Minister Mark Carney expect as he hosts his first summit? Let's bring in the front bench former BC Premier Christy Clark. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Former federal Conservative cabinet minister and MP Monty Sahlberg. He is the CEO of New West Public Affairs. And former NDP MP and BC Minister Nathan Cullen. He's also here. He's now the senior advisor at Strategy Corp. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Christy, I want to start with you on this one. The finance ministers and central bankers seem to take aim at unfair economic practices that generate, quote, excessive imbalances in the global trading system. But there was nothing on trade tensions with the U.S. So do you think that this really was a successful summit?
Well, it's always successful in as much as the personal connections that you make when you're doing these things. You know, like I went to COP in Paris. I went to governors' meetings. I went to, things all around the world when I was a premier. And the connections that you make at those things, the kind of the personal connections, makes a huge difference in the longer term when you want to collaborate. And so I don't think there's a possibility that it was completely unsuccessful from that perspective. And I think I think the trade stuff, you can't deal with it without the elephant in the room. That elephant is Donald Trump. And that's all coming to a theater near you soon. But I think in the meantime, I think François-Philippe Champagne did a good job of representing Canada. One of the things he talked about, though, in his comments that I thought was really important was he acknowledged that there is too much uncertainty in the regulatory process in Canada for investors. And that's the first time I've heard a federal official talk about that. And, if you saw in the mandate letter the Prime Minister wrote to folks, he acknowledged there was too much uncertainty. We are a high-risk investment for countries around the world. And I think, if that's part of what they were talking about behind the scenes, how do we improve Canada's investment climate that's just been hammered? 10 years of Justin, 10 years almost of NDP in British Columbia. It's been really tough time for our standard of living. So I'm glad that there seem to be talking about the right things again. And it's, I'm heartened by it.
Yeah, Monty, how much does this give you any kind of hope that there may be some sort of a consensus when the actual leaders of the G7 are in town next month in Kananaskis?
Well, I'm not overly hopeful. I mean, the finance minister did a very good job of putting a good face on, a difficult situation. But there was one mention of trade in the entire statement and no mentions of tariffs. Now, he assures us that there were discussions behind the scenes, but frankly, until it makes it into the final statement and the final communique, it essentially means that things haven't gone anywhere yet and there's no firm progress, and that's disappointing. The good news is that, Minister Champagne has connected with probably the most responsible and, if I can say it this way, normal member of the Trump administration in Scott Bessent. And he's a good connection to make. I think he wants to generally move things in the right direction. And maybe he can be helpful in moving President Trump off his hardline position on automobile, steel, and aluminum, because that's going to start to bite into Canada very, very quickly. It's already starting. And, that's going to hurt a lot of vulnerable people.
Nathan, how quickly do they need to make progress on what Monty just mentioned there before Trump comes to Canada in June?
Well, typically you would want something announceable if the two parties were interested in actually getting to a better agreement in and around the big meeting in Canada. I guess I generally agree with Christy that those relationships and conversations can help a lot. Yet again, President Trump might be the exception to the rule. Like, it is good to get to know folks and it's good to have those relationships. But what drives this particular president and when and what forces do it is very, very difficult. So it's worth doing, but you don't count on it. I guess, where's our bar being set? The Americans showed up and they didn't storm out. I guess that's our new success for political meetings with our longest trading partner and closest ally. I don't know. We used to say that anyways back in the day. It rolls off the tongue, but it doesn't actually meet up always with our expectations. And I agree with Monty. How do you go through this entire conversation, come out with a communique, and not talk about tariffs? Like that, Canadians are losing their jobs right now. And if we don't settle this thing, thousands and thousands of more will. And that's a problem for this Canadian government. Obviously, they're seized with it. What to expect in the G7? Gosh, I don't know. But if they're going to make any kind of a deal, and I say that in the smallest quotations, the G7 would be a good time to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Christy, do you think that the bar has been lowered when you consider what Nathan said, and when you consider that the G7 in Charlevoix ended with Donald Trump storming out, a photo that I think lives in infamy now with Angela Merkel sort of standing over him and all other leaders standing around him as he sat there. Do you think that we have sort of changed the metric by which we're measuring success now? Because we look at this and say, okay, well, at least nobody stormed out. Everything seems to be okay. But nobody mentioned tariffs.
Yeah, again, I do think that President Trump needs to be in the room for this conversation to happen. Further to what Nathan said, he's an unpredictable character. So I'm not sure how much is to be gained by talking about, really President Trump's trade war. He caused it. He created the problem with the supply chain. So I think they're going to need to have him in the room. I do think, though, we should be thinking too about how this really reflected Canada trying to also reach out to diversify its economy with countries around the world, which was a big part of the election platform for the Liberals, and I think for all the parties. Getting, Japan, Korea, those big economies around the world create markets for our goods there, jobs for our workers here in doing so. And those bilateral relationships outside the American relationship are really important. So this wasn't just personal, how are your kids? This was, hey, look at Canada, invest here, create jobs here, and we will supply you from one democratic country to another with things like energy and all the other things that you can reliably depend on us to give you.
Yeah, and maybe figuring out if that leads to something down the road, as all of you have said here. Okay, we're going to leave this subject here for right now. Coming up, though, one single mandate. Prime Minister Mark Carney goes against the Trudeau tradition, releasing one mandate letter for his entire cabinet. So what does that move tell us about how he will govern? The Front Bench will return after a short break.
The global trading system, which has helped power Canada's prosperity for decades, is undergoing its biggest transformation since the fall of the Berlin Wall. At home, our long-standing weak productivity is making life less affordable for Canadian families. So Canada's new government has an immense responsibility to address these challenges head-on, with focus, new strategies, and determined execution. And that new approach animates the mandate letter that I shared with all members of our ministry at the end of our meeting. It reflects a unified mission.
That was Prime Minister Mark Carney yesterday after announcing he has given his entire cabinet one mandate letter. Now, it's one letter with 7 priorities for his government. Here they are in a nutshell. He wants his team to focus on establishing a new economic and security relationship with the United States while also strengthening collaboration with reliable trading partners and allies around the world. He's looking to remove interprovincial trade barriers and bring down costs for Canadians. Carney says his government will also be focused on making housing more affordable, protecting Canadian sovereignty, and returning to sustainable levels of immigration, while also spending less on government operations. So it's a lot in there for just one letter, but what does this signal about Carney's priorities and how he intends to govern? Let's bring back the front bench. Christy Clark, Monty Sahlberg, and Nathan Cullen. Monty, I'll start with you on this one. So he's made it just one for all. Do you think that this covers everything, or are there some cracks there when you consider there's some ministries that may look at this and go, I don't really see how this applies to me?
No, I think just about everybody's involved. It's just a case of the economic ministers like LeBlanc and Champagne, Joly, Hodgson, et cetera, leading the charge, and other ministers playing a supporting role. David McGuinty will play more of a supporting role probably on national security, but even Minister Diab as immigration minister will will be involved because she'll be expected to ensure that new immigrants to Canada are fully screened and that there's no concerns about security, for instance. So I think it's a good approach, quite frankly. It reminds me of what we did in 2006, where we had 5 priorities. And those ministers led on their issues, and the rest of us, to some degree, fell in behind and supported them and presented the public with something that we could demonstrate we had achieved and show that we had moved the ball forward for Canadians.
Nathan, at the same time in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, when he was issuing mandate letters, made them public for the first time in a long time, but also had really customized them to every one of the ministers, and then actually had a tracker where you could go online and see whether or not they were meeting their goals. When you compare that approach to this one, which one do you think is better?
I generally like the accountability. I like the, at least what was an attempt at accountability for the ministers. We've all served in that type of portfolio where a clear direction from the center and in terms of what you need to get done and what you're going to be held accountable for is helpful. This is a broad list. It's 7 very broad and important things. So you can't quibble with what's on the list, although there'll be some groups and some Canadians that are not going to see themselves on the list and say, well, wait, what are we doing about equality? I don't see a great deal of work here about reconciliation, for example. I was looking through it earlier, trying to find the words climate change in it. You know, there's going to be some folks that are going to be a bit worried, but you can also understand the approach given the threats coming, particularly from the US, and what those economic impacts are going to be, why so much of this is seen through the lens of dealing with Donald Trump, frankly, and the pressures that have been building on Canadians for a long time who have been trying and can't afford to buy a house, and the list is long. And that was the argument of the last election, both of those things, cost of living and Donald Trump. And I think these 7 priorities are meant to encapsulate that and give some focus. We'll see. I like novelty. I like new approaches. Nothing wrong with that. We'll see if it makes any difference.
Christy, one thing that I thought was interesting in this letter was one passage where he says, over the coming weeks, I will look to each of you to identify the key goals and measures of success on which to evaluate the results that you will achieve for Canadians as a member of the ministry. Feels like a bit of empowerment that he's trying to give to his ministers and saying, look, I'm not going to draw you a roadmap, but you got to make sure that you come back to me with a path forward.
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways of doing this. I actually think that the whole mandate letter idea as it stands now started in 2001 with Gordon Campbell's government in BC. I could be wrong. There could be another originator, but it's something we always did. And my view of it is, first and foremost, the mandate letter's purpose is not just to get the minister going. More importantly, it's to make sure that all of those layers in the civil service have goals to work to, that they know what they're doing, that there's some beginnings of a plan. So, you know, the lack of specificity, I think, is something that's going to come next. So broad strokes of what he wants to do, very much focused on jobs, workers, economic growth, growing tax revenues through more employment, and you know, and finding investment for the things to diversify our markets. All of that's in there at broad strokes. Then he's saying to the ministers, okay, we want you and your deputies to come up with a specific plan. So say you're in housing, for example. Gregor Robertson is going to have to sit down with his deputy and talk about, okay, how many houses are we planning to, what are our goals for the first year, second year, third year, fourth year? And really get down to, at some granular level. My hope is that those will also become public, because that's the real accountability. I mean, you want to make sure the civil service knows what they're supposed to be doing, but you want to make sure the public has some measures that they can hold you to. And you know, my hope is, and I think this is what they're going to do, is in a couple of months we will see that specificity, because the ministers will have had the time to work through that.
Feels like
Monty,
a more
how important is
approach.
that?
Sorry, Mike. It seems like this would be a much more corporate governance structure from a CEO handing this down, and as Christy said, now come back to me with deliverables and goals that I'm going to measure you against. I also got a little sense of, if you don't perform, ... I just, in the way he's spoken about putting this cabinet together, which I think might be a little different than in cabinets past.
Yeah, Monty, what do you think about that, especially in the report back to me and to Christy's point about making sure that you report back to Canadians as well? Because I think the expectations from people who voted for the Liberals is pretty high.
Well, this is the role of the opposition, of course, to make sure that people do meet the objectives that the government has put before them. And certainly the Conservatives, the NDP, Bloc, et cetera, will all be doing that. But Christie's completely correct when she says the public service needs their marching orders. They need something to work off of, and so they'll be busy looking at these 7 priorities, and identifying the areas in their departments where they can do some things that will help the government meet these objectives. That'll become part of the conversation with the minister. And ministers, I think, ultimately will present these back to the government, say, here's how we're going to contribute. So this will all fall into place for them. They'll figure that out. The question is whether or not they can achieve these objectives, because they are lofty. I mean, these are big objectives. After 10 years of stagnant growth, they've got to get the economy going again at a time when we're facing tariffs, low oil prices, and a lot of uncertainty in the world. And so the plans are one thing. It's achieving them that's the really hard thing.
Yeah, and of course, Tim Hodgson's going to be out your way soon, tomorrow, and he's going to be talking to the oil patch, and we will see how people are starting to respond to his call for investment, and whether or not Canadians in Alberta, which is a powerhouse economic producer for Canada, are they going to accept this? Are they going to believe it? Is it enough? And I think tomorrow is going to be a really crucial test for the government.
It's a sold-out event, I can tell you, and everybody will be there. They're dying to know whether or not there's going to be an olive branch. But full marks to Minister Hodgson, the Prime Minister, and to Champagne for going out there and meeting with the Alberta government and really demonstrating a bit of goodwill that was so completely lacking under Prime Minister Trudeau. And I can tell you, people are just glad for the change. They're glad he is gone.
Okay. Unfortunately, we got to leave it there. I want to thank Christy Clark, Monty Solberg, and Nathan Cullen for being part of the front bench today. When we return from this break, we're going to get you the latest details on the looming Canada Post strike or lockout, which could happen as soon as tomorrow. Stay tuned. Power Play will be right back. And just before we leave you tonight, we are just about 6 hours away from another possible Canada Post strike. Now, the company did table that new global offer, and we have heard from the union that they are now meeting with the company and a mediator, and those meetings are expected to go into the night. Thank you so much for joining us. That's your Power Play Day in Politics. Be sure to join us tomorrow, where Colton Prail will be here. Stay tuned to CTV News for all the latest on the Canada Post strike. Have yourselves a good night, everyone.